so much. Thank you very much. Well, that was a lovely introduction, and I feel you've told everyone what's in my talk now. So, I'm just going to check whether I can share my screen with you first of all, and if I can't, I had a bit of a problem with this yesterday. I will go to ask someone to do it for me. Hang on. Now, I don't think I think I've got the same problem. Something has happened with my software. Can somebody show the PowerPoint for me?
Yes, ma'am. I will show your PowerPoint. Can you see it, ma'am? Dr. Jenkins?
No, I can't see it yet. Are you able to see it?
Can the participants see it?
Nope.
Oh, I'm sharing my screen.
Oh, here we are. Excellent, thank you. Okay, so look, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this really, really interesting conference. And I mean, it's a lovely example of how we're all reimagining conference space, you know, connected through these platforms. It's not a substitute for meeting in person, and I hope, I love the analogies with the mangoes. I hope we will all meet each other in a different way sometime in the future. Before I go any further, I want to acknowledge the country I'm speaking from, which is Ngunnawal and Ngambri country here in Canberra, and pay respects to elders past and present. This is going to be a presentation that's based on a paper that is coming out very soon in the Journal of Social Philosophy as part of a special issue that I've been editing with Amandine Katala. I think the actual special issue is going to be next year, but hopefully this paper will be online fairly soon. I want to put it in the context of some of the work I've been doing on women in philosophy for some time now, as well as in the context of the Gendered Excellence in Social Sciences project that you mentioned in that lovely introduction. So if you go to the next slide. Back in, I guess, around 2009, I started to think about this problem of women in philosophy, and Katrina Hutchison, with whom I edited this book, was a postgraduate student at the time in philosophy at ANU, and a very strong report was issued by the Australasian Association of Philosophy in 2008. I think we came across it a little bit later, but it was about the participation of women in the philosophy profession. And it quoted this particular article by Sally Aslanger, which I think had a huge influence on sort of getting this debate underway, changing the ideology and culture of philosophy, not by reason alone. And Sally Haslanger opens that article describing a deep well of rage inside of me, rage about how I as an individual have been treated in philosophy, rage about how others I know have been treated, and rage about the conditions that I'm sure affect many women and minorities in philosophy and have caused many others to leave. And I think it was a real rallying cry that we also responded to. I must say, I had somehow managed to not notice really that I was the only woman in the faculty of the philosophy school, although I had been for some time. And I think that was probably because that was pretty much how it always was. I remember when I was at the University of Essex, there was one other woman who was also called Fiona. So everybody used to mix us up all the time. And, you know, I could go on and on, I won't, but many issues that I had long sort of encountered became things that I was suddenly very, very aware of. And we started working on this project, Katrina and I, it grew and grew, and we ended up with this lovely publication with Oxford that came out in 2013. Now, I think one of the things I want to reflect on today is the kind of analysis that was sort of used in several of the essays in that book, which I now have some reservations about how useful they are, I guess. If we can go to the next slide, let me first comment on the kind of progress that has or has not been made. So I think clearly we have made a lot of progress in terms of a whole range of ways in which this problem of women in philosophy has become accepted as a problem, has become accepted as something that we really need to take seriously. But at the same time, if you actually look at progress, this is comparing 2003 with 2017 in philosophy in Australia, and this is data collected by the AAP, you can see that although there's some progress, certainly level D has grown. At level E, actually in 2017, things have gone backwards slightly, and that is extraordinary given the already incredibly low levels of women at that level. This is full professor, level D is associate professor. Yes, level C has gone up a bit. I mean, maybe this will flow through. But then again, maybe, people are getting promoted late in their careers, and it, won't necessarily have a huge impact on those percentages at full professor level. If we can go to the next slide and look at what's happening in the UK, there's a report that's just been released by the British Philosophical Society. Helen Beebe and Jennifer Saul have done a lot of work in this area. There is, again, some improvement. There they see slightly better improvements at professorial level. But nonetheless, they're a very long way from anything that you would call gender parity. And there continue to be very large gaps at PhD student level, which of course suggests that, if you take a sort of pipeline approach, it's going to not be very promising down the track. Even if you sort of followed the course that you're on, it would take at least another 20 years to achieve parity at permanent staff level. So it's not evident that we've made huge changes in the last decade or so. And of course, academia is slow to change. But I do think there are questions that are worth asking about the kinds of analysis that we're giving, what we're focused on, and really just to open up a little bit of a debate around approaches that have become very sort of firm and fixed in terms of how we look at these problems. If I could have the next slide, please. So this is just a kind of broad overview of some of the sort of themes that I see in our current approaches and some of the questions that I have about it. When people ask, why do we see these patterns? There's, I think, quite a predominance of socio-psychological approaches that have a great deal of currency in other contexts as well. So I think one of the contexts that we should be aware of when talking about how we've approached the problems of women in philosophy is that they have very much been aligned with wider societal discussion and approaches that have been taken in organizations, certainly across universities. Not sure if you're familiar with things like the Athena Swan initiative in the UK, but basically a way of approaching initially issues for women in STEM, but now much broader, looking at all sorts of academic disciplines. And these kind of mainstream approaches very much use a certain set of tools to think about what's underlying these gender gaps, which is taken to be forms of discrimination that may not be totally conscious, but they're a kind of unconscious space in which decisions are being made that are systematically producing these distorted results. So, I mean, of course, one of the things that's really striking about philosophy is that it has almost 50-50 balance at undergraduate level, and then you tail off to these incredibly low levels of women further down the pipeline, and that is what seems to be requiring explanation. And so we get a focus on things like people's implicit biases when we're making decisions. Jennifer Saul's done a lot of work on that. Stereotype threats, the way in which you can sort of feel less confident in a space because you are not representative of the norm. Micro inequities, ways in which, you know, tiny forms of discrimination can add up over a space of years or a career into this kind of disadvantage. And more broadly, the ways in which gender schemas shape people's choices. So philosophy, for example, is often said to be a male-associated discipline, and this entails that women don't feel they belong, or they simply don't choose to go on in philosophy, and so forth. Now, I've put on the right some of the things that are suggested in response to those problems. Certainly implicit bias training has been something that's been offered, but also there's been an awareness of poor climates in philosophy. So things like sexual harassment and sexual violence in philosophy have been a very strong focus, alongside promoting diversity in curricula, having schools sign up to good practice programs, and so on and so forth. Now, what I really want to comment on this in part is how this avoids certain other kinds of approaches that you might take. And one of the things that's become very apparent to me working on the Gendered Excellence project that I'll talk about in a moment is that people in different disciplines use a different range of tools to look at problems. We'll go in a moment to look at Kieran Healy, who's a sociologist, giving an analysis of where philosophy's problems might lie. In the background, though, we do have some reference to a long legacy of feminist philosophy, which has been reflecting on the character of philosophy as a discipline, its forms of rationality. It's been hard at work through journals like Hypatia, expanding the terrain of the discipline. It's been raising fresh questions, linking into other fields. It's been promoting very often some version of a standpoint epistemology, saying that it really matters, that women might see problems and questions, say, of moral philosophy in a different way, and that standpoint needs to feed through into philosophical discussion that often thinks of itself as very context transcendent. And this is something that I'll come back to. So, some of my questions have become, I suppose, somewhat more critical about the kind of analysis that we're giving of these issues, asking what this data really shows, why it matters, what's our goal in thinking about gender equity? Is it obviously 50-50 representation of men and women? What sort of challenges to disciplinary character might we be raising? What innovation do women and other minorities bring to the discipline? So what's diversity in curriculum for? In general, what should we do with this kind of feminist critique of philosophy? So if I can go to the next slide, I'll show you an example of an approach that I think is very different from the ones that focus on bias. And this has certainly inspired some of the work that I've done on the Gendered Excellence project. So this is Kieran Healy's co-citation network model, where he looked at 4 leading philosophy journals. I think Mind was one of them, and you can see it in his study. And he looked at the patterns by which articles were being co-cited within that space. So what he maps here, and it's this kind of network mapping, actually, if you go into the site that he has this on, it will kind of move around because you can sort of center it in different ways. So it's quite sophisticated modeling. But I think what's interesting about this picture, 2 things. Well, first of all, in over 500 most cited items over 20 years, less than 20 items are by women, and those are marked with red dots on that thing. And one of them actually is by Sally Haslanger. And if you ask her about this, she will tell you that it's not, it's not an article that she's particularly impressed with herself, but it happens to be one that comments on David Lewis's work. And David Lewis, of course, is at the center of what's fancifully named here Pluralitania, just as David Chalmers is at the center of Zombie Empire. And what you see in the way in which the sort of the discipline is structured is something I think is very recognizable to any of us who work in a fairly analytic philosophy department. These are the kinds of topics, issues that have become very central. They're focused on what you might think of as the fairly charismatic work of one particular philosopher. And it creates a sort of field of power in which anybody who is working in the discipline is bound to have to position themselves. Of course, it's very noticeable on this diagram that there is absolutely nothing by feminist philosophers. And that is something that I will come back to in a moment. Could I have the next slide, please? All right, so to come back to really what I want to focus in on in this paper, one of the things that I think is interesting is that we don't tend to look at those kind of mappings of power, accumulated privilege, the ways in which certain narratives about the discipline and certain ways in which the discipline has historically developed. We don't really take those into account very much when we're thinking about the gender gap. In fact, what we tend to focus on is a pretty, I think, increasingly presumptive sort of model of progress. And I'm sort of using Virginia Valian's title, Why So Slow, to sum this up. So that came out in 1997, and it's very influential, I think, in terms of the way in which it works with that sort of socio-psychological literature that I was talking about earlier. Why so slow? It's a question that implies that we're on some natural trajectory of progress towards gender equality, which will be indicated by us achieving 50-50 gender balance. And I think it's very interesting to think about that sort of model of progress alongside questions about the kind of story we want to tell ourselves about knowledge and progress in knowledge, and how those two are sort of brought together through some of these kind of frameworks of analysis that have become so familiar to us. So in this article, I'm not going to spend an enormous amount of time on it here, but in the article, I really begin from quite a lengthy discussion of Louise Anthony's Different Voices or a Perfect Storm, which is a very influential article, I think, in terms of how this space is constructed. And one of the things I started to notice about the article is how much it relies on disciplinary comparison. So just in this quote, for example, she says, philosophers, I suspect, broadly regard themselves as smarter than others in the humanities and think of themselves as particularly sensitive to fallacious or ungrounded reasoning, and I do not exempt myself from this indictment. If I'm right about philosophers' attitudes, then not only will philosophers be intractable about instituting reforms in evaluative practices, they will be more susceptible to the unconscious biases that they do have. And I think when you read that a few times, it starts to become stranger and stranger, really, as a statement. I mean, it's one of the sort of classic ideas about implicit bias, that the more you think you're unbiased, the more vulnerable you are to these unconscious implicit biases. And so that's, on the face of it, the main point that is being made there. But at the same time, it's very characteristic, and I've started to notice it more and more, that nonetheless, there's a very sort of strong commitment to reasoning and the capacities of reasoning that are being affirmed here. And I think that's one of the reasons why she says, I don't exempt myself from this indictment. This is kind of a professional qualification that we're talking about here. And the risk is that philosophers who ought to be capable of this, pure reasoning are actually going to be influenced by pernicious social forces that are going to distort the proper outcomes of their reasoning. And throughout the article, there's a very strong contrast drawn between philosophy and the other humanities, all of which are described as somehow less rigorous, less, troubled then by these problems, but also as much more feminized. So throughout this article, philosophy is seen as a male-associated discipline. It's compared to mathematics. When the question of different voices is engaged, an analogy is made with mathematical intuition to say that, well, if women have different views about moral questions, then the proper answer is that, someone is wrong. And this is the case is made through an analogy with mathematical intuition. So it's an interesting article to take a sort of slightly deconstructive approach to. And having done that, I started to notice how common this analogy is. So Jennifer Saul, for example, here saying mathematics is heavily stereotyped as male. It seems reasonable to suppose that Anglophone philosophy, with its heavy use of logic, will inherit this stereotype. And it seems to me that there's a lot, again, that's being done to describe, contain, say what the discipline is. And I've become more and more puzzled about how an idea of discipline is at stake in these questions, and what comparison with other disciplines, what work that is actually doing in these arguments. So the kind of questions that I ask in this article are really trying to open up the space of, well, what is the problem that we're looking at when we talk about these gender gaps, when we talk about progress being so slow, when we characterize the discipline in certain ways as part of that conversation. And of course, any characterization of a very old and inherently very plural kind of discipline, such as philosophy, it has many associations. You could say it's associated with being socially useless and, a kind of bullshit discipline. I mean, you could say that, but it's here constantly kind of associated with logic and mathematical disciplines. And whereas sometimes that's supposed to be just about, well, philosophy is like these mathematical disciplines in having fewer women, there's a very strong slippage, I think, into saying, and this is the proper character of philosophy, it really is like these disciplines. And so, you get this kind of epistemological dimension coming into a story about what the discipline is. So that's where I think maybe it's going to be really interesting if we start to look at philosophy and position it among the social sciences. And really, this is partly because this is work I've done. I started to look at philosophy among the social sciences. But towards the end of that project, I guess I found myself asking, well, how does that really reorient us somewhat in how we're thinking about these questions? And the really interesting question that I think is coming through this is about the relationship between ideas about progress on gender and ideas of epistemic progress. And I mean, again, this is a theme that comes up in what's sometimes called the business case for gender equality in the sciences. So there's a project that Londa Schiebinger has been leading in called Gendered Innovations, which we've responded to and related to a lot in my project. And it's really a series of case studies kind of demonstrating that if you factor gender into engineering and sciences, you get better social outcomes. And it becomes, again, a very powerful narrative for building consensus around the importance of gender equality. And I think it also makes a lot of assumptions that are quite problematic about what the social good is, how gender equality contributes to that, what gender equality is, what is brought in by women's perspectives, and so on and so forth. But I won't go into that, but it was certainly something that emerged from our project as being very interesting. Could I have the next slide, please? All right, so I think I've covered some of that, but But just look at the colored bit on the right. So one of the ways in which I tried to organize this set of thoughts about epistemic progress and progress on gender equity is to consider what happens if we identify two different accounts of philosophy as a discipline. And one of these is very strongly wedded to philosophy's kind of context transcendent rigor. And I think Louise Antony is a very good example of someone organizing her thoughts about the question of women in philosophy very much around that position. And then the other, which is much more attuned to some of the ways in which feminist philosophy, I think, has developed, seeing philosophy as embedded in social worlds, perhaps lends itself to setting up a comparison with social sciences. And there's all sorts of questions here about how social sciences conceive themselves, which I touch on in the paper, but I won't go into here. So really, I want something quite schematic here, that we've got a contrast between, if you like, how we think of the progress of the discipline in terms that are quite indifferent to social change. We've got a kind of model of progressive transformation through incremental gains in knowledge. And this is very sort of close to how we might, you know, naively or not think about hard sciences. We've got a kind of paradigm for something that offers a lot of integrity, a lot of stability to the discipline, right? If what it's got to do is just kind of progress in this context transcendent way, then it's not going to, for example, it's not going to have to take account of what feminist philosophers might be going on about. It's instead going to see the problems it has around gender, if it comes to terms with those, as very much in this space of women's careers, you know, something we should rectify because there's clearly some distortion going on, some social biases are playing a role, but really we want to keep the question of what the discipline is and the kind of integrity of the discipline separate from that. And then on the other hand, we've got some kind of idea of a sort of social embeddedness of the discipline, which would suggest that it's really significant if the discipline is ignoring the kind of insights, say, that are coming from new participants, let's say in this case, feminist philosophy. And that it's the whole question then of the discipline is actually really important to what we're seeing here and what we're kind of seeing as a kind of progress. Can I have the next slide, please? All right, so let me just turn then to this project that's coming to a close. Can I go to the next slide? Because I think you've seen that. Yeah, so we have this comparative project with 5 disciplines: economics, philosophy, sociology, history, and political science. And the aims of the project are really to think about the relationship between how women have fared in all of these disciplines, all of which had, you know, low percentages of women in the 1970s. And they've changed in very different ways through to the present moment. And just looking at that comparison is actually, I think, really interesting and throws up some really important questions for us. And one of the points that I want to draw out here is that in looking at this data, we're in a very different sort of comparative space from the one that we are when we say, oh, philosophy is like the hard sciences, it's like the mathematical disciplines, it has this gender problem, and it's totally unlike the feminized humanities. You know, that kind of gesture that I was saying gets made in Louise Antony's article. So one of the questions that's emerged for me out of this is the question of, well, what happens if we shift that comparative space, right? What happens if we look at disciplines that have actually changed from being very light philosophy, very low representation of women in the 70s, and now they're pretty much gender balanced, or even women predominate? What happens if we stop thinking about what causes backwardness and start thinking instead about what's caused success? Or I want to slightly avoid the causal language, but what does success look like? What has happened in that history that has actually resulted in these differences? I'll come to that in just a second, a bit further. But our initial hypothesis was that that where disciplines have changed a lot, we also see really significant mainstreaming of gender and feminist perspectives within those disciplines. And again, I'll show you some data in a moment that I think does partially bear that out. Then the project's been interested in thinking at this level of, I suppose what I'm introducing here, sort of discourses about gender equality. What sort of stories do we tell about why any of this matters? What are we trying to, you know, other than the kind of intrinsic fairness of gender equality, how does this question of women's representation or wider diversity issues actually matter in disciplinary terms? You know, do disciplines have different stories about this, or is there just a generic kind of argument that gets made? And then we've also, as I mentioned, played around with gendered innovations, how we might think about feminist perspectives or factoring gender, how does that change or improve social science? All right, and as I sort of mentioned, I think there's a lot one can draw from feminist science studies and the kind of work that people like Sandra Harding have done in this space to suggest that the kind of questions that we're asking are actually really important ones, but they are much more kind of sociological in orientation than some of the forms of analysis that have become predominant. Can I have the next slide, please? All right, so I'm just going to show you these fairly quickly, but one comment I would make on our data on this was it was much harder to get than we thought it was going to be. We do not have strictly comparable data across the countries that we looked at, and different sources will give you different data points, but broadly what you see is that economics is slightly worse than philosophy, political science tends to be slightly better, history much better, and sociology, you know, very gender balanced, generally outperforming all the others, if that is your indicator. So can I just go to the next slide, which is a little bit easier perhaps to sort of comment on. So I mean, this is the data that we have on Australia, and one of the issues that you can see sort of represented here is that different sources will give you different accounts. So the Australian Research Council, or ARC, has been collecting data now since 2017 at a disciplinary level. It previously did not do that. It was one of the things that we were asking for them to give us, because they did have that data, but they weren't publishing it. And because they're working off research coding, they will pick up disciplinary patterns at the level of, are you coding your work as, you know, this code in history? It doesn't matter if you're in a school of history, if you're coding your work in that way, you will show up in their data. Whereas the other sources are often associations, and they're tending to be doing head counts of people in schools. And in many of these disciplines, you have people who are working, you know, they're coding their work in one way, and they're actually in another kind of school or department. So the data is quite complex. But once again, you see some evidence of the kind of pattern that I'm talking about. And again, in every case, sociology and history perform much better than philosophy or political science, and you can pretty much rely on economics to come last in this patterning. And there's a remarkable consistency internationally with this data, except for history, which changes quite a lot, which is, you know, raises some quite interesting questions about why that's so as well. Can I go to the next slide, please? All right, so let me just kind of touch on some of the ways in which we looked at that sort of background data about rates of representation of women in these 5 disciplines and the kinds of evidence that we could find about how far feminist or gender perspectives have been taken up in these disciplines. And again, whenever you're working with this kind of data, it's going to be very complex. But if you're interested in this stuff, the main article that we produced on all of this is the one cited at the bottom. Rebecca Pierce was our postdoc on the project. And this is some of the data that she collected. So this is looking at the rates at which there are keywords mentioning gender or feminist perspectives in, we actually did this with 6 disciplines because we separated international relations out from political science because it seemed to have some quite different patterns. So this is between 1990 and 2015. And once again, you see very clearly that sociology is the kind of home of gender and feminist perspectives amongst these disciplines. It has very high rates of mention, though it has, as you see here, it wasn't always so, right? So, one of the things that interests me here is if you look at this data and say, yes, women are overrepresented now in sociology, they have these really high rates of engagement with feminist and gender research. It always was a kind of feminized discipline. And that's the kind of the gesture that you get in quite a lot of people who are talking about philosophy as very male associated. So sociology is very female associated. Well, actually not always so. And one of the things that is interesting about sociology is that there was a huge struggle about, what categories of social analysis were most apt to the problems that sociology should entertain. And class, it'd be quite interesting to go back before this 1990, but, what are the rates of mention of class in sociological analysis? Probably they have been changing in a very interesting pattern as well. But gender certainly has become a aspect of any kind of sociological analysis that anyone is going to take seriously. And you get similar patterns in history, that there's, clear mainstreaming of the questions that have been raised by feminist scholars to the point where gender becomes just an automatic category that you're going to engage with in terms of your approach to historical questions. Now, if we go right down to economics, you can see some level of engagement. Philosophy, it's almost nothing. It's really, really negligible. And that is quite interesting, I think. I mean, it suggests that philosophy as a discipline has not gone through this process of kind of mainstreaming these perspectives. You might say, well, that makes sense because actually it is this kind of context transcendent, hard discipline that it's not going to engage with these questions that obviously all these social oriented disciplines do. You can see it raises a lot of interesting questions how we read this kind of data. Can I go to the next slide, please? So this is another piece of work that we did. Again, it's in the article by Rebecca Pierce. And it's looking at the kind of circulation of citations within disciplines. And what it does is it takes what we identified as the top 10 discipline journals, which we used as a kind of proxy for mainstreaming. And we compared citation patterns in those with specialist feminist journals in each of our disciplines. So in philosophy's case, that was Hypatia. In politics, it was philosophy and gender. In sociology, it was gender and society, and so forth. You can see it down at the bottom. So just to kind of summarize some of the findings there, we found that the feminist and gender research journals in sociology and political science and history all had high rates of citation within their discipline. So what we thought of as interdisciplinary citation. In fact, they had higher rates than a comparator set of the top 10 disciplinary journals, which shows that, you know, they have a significant status. They are, the kinds of knowledge they produce are thoroughly circulating within those spaces. In philosophy and economics, by contrast, there's a really large gap between the citation patterns that are characteristic of the mainstream top 10 disciplinary journals and the leading disciplinary journal publishing feminist and gender research. And to sum up what the overall finding here really was, that, you know, that is interesting in terms of philosophy, it's that, you know, philosophers read philosophers, but they don't read feminist philosophers. So it's a very, on this portrayal, it's a very inward-looking discipline that's also structured by a very strong pattern of exclusion of feminist work. And at the same time, there's a relatively very large circulation of feminist philosophy outside the discipline. So feminist philosophy has a very high proportion of its readership actually outside the discipline of philosophy. So, and that's also true to some extent of economic, so feminist economics, which again is a very marginalized field. It's a very high percentage of its readership from outside, and wider circulation in that space than the mainstream discipline. So the characteristic of this kind of feminist marginal work is that it goes forth and conquers there. Feminist philosophy is very widely read outside the discipline, but very little read within the discipline. Could I have the next slide, please? All right. Actually, no, it's all right. Just go back to the previous one if you don't mind. Thank you. Okay, so look, I just want to draw out some comments on this in terms of where this might take us. So one of the things that we're looking at here is something that Lorraine Code remarks upon when she really, you know, this is an article from 2014 in Australian Feminist Studies, which was one of the early pieces of work that we did on this project. And her argument really is that philosophy's problems are to do with precisely its attachment to transcending the influence of social worlds, right? That it is a discipline that's been shaped by a desire to attach itself to certain forms of knowledge and reason. And that is why we see its negligible rates of engagement with feminist research. It's a very positive, you know, turning the back on that kind of work. And one of the stories I like to compare with here is something that Alison Wiley has researched in the field of archaeology, where she did a fairly detailed engagement with what was happening in archaeology as women first entered that disciplinary space, and started in the context of the kind of feminist movements that actually had brought them into archaeology to raise very deep questions about how narratives about gender and assumptions about gender roles were shaping the whole way in which the evidence from the past was being interpreted. So ideas about, you know, the men going out hunting and the women sort of quietly, you know, gathering, and the sort of stereotypes that were shaping those kinds of stories. And as those kind of questions gained momentum, they caused huge kind of disturbance to very kind of accepted narratives about the distant past. And in turn, evidence could be read in new ways, and a lot of the sort of foundational stories started to come into question. And one of the things that she comments on here, which I think is really interesting for, you know, the questions that we're discussing, is that many women in the discipline also found this very disquieting, this kind of disruptive work was very problematic for women who had only just made it into this kind of respectable field. So the ways in which deep questions of kind of epistemic credibility for the discipline were at stake were actually related to by different women in different ways. So some welcomed the disruptions, but others felt very much like they needed to defend the kind of integrity of the discipline and the approach, and recognizing that it would be open to this kind of deep distortion was actually something that led them to see such gendered interventions as quite ideological, and to be very kind of wary of adopting them. So I think that story tells you something really interesting about how problematic it is a space for women who have come into the discipline, carved out new questions, new areas of research, and then are seen as having destabilized something really, foundational about what the discipline is. And so I actually discussed that story in quite a lot of the work related to this project, because I think it raises interesting questions about how we're, as it were, identifying different interests in this space of pursuing questions of women's participation, but also the kinds of different voices, to use Anthony's phrase, that are brought in there. But I think also you could put a more positive spin on the findings here. What's really clear from the existence of these journals and their, real prowess in the field is that as women have entered social sciences, they have generated new lines of scholarly research. They have created specialist journals. This kind of innovation has received very different kinds of uptake. But really, we should remember the sort of agency and the kinds of success that are involved in making this happen. And sometimes that success has not fed through into disciplinary change. That's what we see with philosophy. But equally, we should remember that it has fed through into many really interdisciplinary and highly exciting, productive new projects. So if we just look at the discipline level, we tend to see lack, we infer bias, we are concerned about that set of questions. But if we think about the successes and the influence and the other new questions that we may not yet have corralled under the heading of disciplinary philosophy, but are actually something really to pay attention to, I think we get maybe a slightly different sense of where we should be looking. And certainly if you then relate that back to career structures, one of the things that's long been commented on is that at the level of PhD or beyond, there's very strong tendency for women to opt out of philosophy, but to go into other disciplines, something that Sally Haslanger comments on in that article I quoted at the beginning. And I think if you think about that in terms of how perhaps some of these, exciting interdisciplinary fields are attracting people who have interest in certain kinds of questions, it raises a set of issues about how do we think about women's careers in this space. I mean, really, should we just be measuring what happens within philosophy? Does it really matter if what is happening is, if you like, there's a kind of attractor space outside philosophy that's drawing women out? How do we reckon with these kinds of mobility that are clearly apparent in the space around philosophy? So I think that's also an important practical question for us to consider. Okay, so the next slide. Okay, so I think this one I didn't actually mean to leave in quite in this way, but look, what I'm pointing to here is that, so, I've set up this contrast between philosophy imagined as a kind of context transcendent, hard, rigorous, logical kind of discipline versus philosophy is kind of embedded in social worlds. Now, of course, that's quite crude in all sorts of ways, but maybe it helps us to see certain things. But I think one of the things that I want to point to in these remarks is that it's much easier for us to imagine that what we've got is this discipline whose progress is going to, is going to be conducted through pure reason. It's going to get more and more clever in how it thinks about questions of mind or whatever. And all the questions about the gender gap are kind of external to that. They're exterior to that kind of progress. So although we think they're unfair and we think that philosophers are making bad judgments about who to appoint or who to promote because they're not seeing the kind of raw talent that's there, we don't need to attend to all these kind of patterns that I'm pointing to. Or if we look at that sort of issue about, where our feminist philosophers cited, we might say there's obviously biases going on, there's obviously undervaluation of women going on, and of women's work, but, we'll sort that when we sort the career structure out. One of the things I think is interesting about the kind of work I've just shown is that it's actually much, much messier. So if we think about what has caused success, I think that's a very, very difficult question to answer. I think it forces you to think about disciplines as quite complex cultures that are impacted by a wide range of factors, and there's not going to be a single simple story that you can tell. And I think that's really important because I think we like to imagine that there are, if you like, these sort of mechanistic models, these pipeline models, which tell you, what the levers are, what you have to press in order to move towards greater progress. Those are very appealing. They're exactly what the sort of managerial class that runs universities want to know. They want to know, what are the simple, 2 things you want me to do in order to fix this problem. And I'm not sure that the effectiveness of those models is actually borne out by any kind of history. So one of the things that, we might contrast here is, well, what has actually changed in some of these disciplinary spaces as a result of us trying to eliminate implicit biases and so on. I mean, you can always say we haven't given it long enough. We're still working on it. And that's fair enough. That's true. But I think it's also really interesting to think, well, how different does it look if we actually are thinking about what history might teach us? What kind of historical learning might we get from spending time looking at, well, why is history so different from philosophy? Why is that? History had a terrible kind of great man problem, just as philosophy did or has. History was about great men. Men were more objective and rational and therefore would do history properly. Women couldn't do it. I mean, all of that is there in the 70s, and yet it changes. And it strikes me that suggests that your whole analysis about gender schemas and biases and those kind of things that we rely on a lot to explain problems in philosophy, we should at least question what happened in history that was, able to change that. And the whole difficulty of telling a story there, I think, is really something that we should spend more time with. Have the next slide, please. All right, so just to conclude, and I can see I'm up against the end of my time, so that's perfect. And I'm sorry that this is also small, but that's really, I guess, what I was just saying. I think there's a real risk that we have a certain kind of solution in mind, and that it's one that's sort of modeled on this purely kind of representational basis. We think we say enough about the norm of progress when we say what we're aiming at is 50-50. And I think that 50-50 is a really interesting, quite problematic kind of way of organizing that normative space as well. So it actually doesn't help us think about other kinds of diversity and what we're looking for there either. So those are some of the further questions that we might look at here. But the really interesting thing is, like, what are we doing with our sense of how disciplines change over time and what kinds of disruption they can absorb, and how far do we want to make the extent to which gender perspectives have actually been integrated into the disciplines as part of the story about progress. And I think, you know, as a practical matter, that's really quite important, because where you have schools of philosophy, say, that have a certain kind of masculine profile at the moment, it may not be that hard for them to reach 50-50 by bringing in women who work in the areas that that school already works in. They could do it without bringing in any feminist philosophers at all. And would that matter? That's, I think, an important question to consider. So on the right, I've just put in the sort of concluding words of that article I've been referring to, where I think really it's very important for us sort of responsibilities in this space to think about disciplines in other ways, right? Not to accept this just very, here's what philosophy is, here's the problem with how, you know, philosophers judge women in their careers. You know, so I think opening up the challenges of narrating different stories about this, testing questions of, you know, well, what do we really want to see? Which are much more open-ended, difficult questions, and problematic in view of how far we've established a consensus around a certain kind of approach to how we engage with women's underrepresentation in philosophy. So I think, you know, I think I am really with just a lot of questions and a sense that there are certainly different things that we could be looking at, and really sort of trying to specify why they're important is something of an ongoing task that we have when we look at these questions of women in philosophy. I will end there. Thank you so much.